when should we be using GraphQL versus where should we be using REST. So GraphQL and REST are both ways to contact a server, to call a server, and to ask for information of the server. If you have a server that manages a repository of bicycles, then you can call this server and ask it, give it the availability of the bicycle. Is it available on this street? And you can do this with two types of request. Usually, this is the usual. So one way is the REST way and another way is the GraphQL way. What we don't want to do is just to choose one of the technologies based on hype or based on how advanced it is. Because when we look at GraphQL, it looks like marvelous, sophisticated. We can use a query language and get whatever we want. However, usually the con of these sophisticated and smart services is that they are complicated. Let's take an example. First, let's briefly describe. With GraphQL, we can query a service and ask it to give us results, and inside the query, we would give it a JSON. So if I want all the available bicycles in the city Tel Aviv, then I would call it and ask it to give me all the bicycles in the city Tel Aviv and pass basically all these parameters of the query inside the JSON. So it's defaulting to post request, and inside the JSON I would pass all these parameters. While in a REST call, I would call a URL /bicycles, and then I could either pass a couple of parameters in the URL, city equals Tel Aviv. Okay, so we already see that in the REST interface, it's much simpler. We call the URL. We pass the parameters in the URL. And if you want, you can open your browser and just call it. This is much harder in GraphQL. When you use GraphQL, you have to add libraries, and you need to create this JSON. You cannot really use curl or wget. So we see this is becoming complex. So if we want to use GraphQL, we need to justify it, that our queries are to the server are dynamic, that we need to get data from multiple services, and therefore only then we need to introduce this GraphQL intermediate service. Also, we have now another service to manage, the GraphQL service. So if our use case is complex, we cannot predict truly the queries that we are going to have. They are going to be complex. We want the client to be able to choose which fields to return in the results and not have the server decide on it. So in the REST way, the server decides on it. When you call a URL, when you call a REST interface, then the server would decide which attributes to return. But in GraphQL, you can decide which attributes to return. The client would decide on this. Okay, so we see that GraphQL adds us with dynamicity and with the ability to specify the parameters from the client side. But do we really need it? Do we really need it? Because if we have a couple of URLs, we can start with REST, have a couple of URLs, have a couple of REST interfaces, and only when we get to extreme use cases that involve complex queries that would eventually query multiple services, etc. Only then we should go to GraphQL. Also, the added complexity of having another service in the middle, we really need to justify it. There is no right or wrong here. It's all a matter of trade-offs. In GraphQL, we use JSON to query the service. We describe actually the fields. We can do mutations. We can do subscriptions on the service. Both of them, it's true that both of them use HTTP request response, both of them under the hood. But GraphQL defaults to everything is a post request. Also, when you want to get something, you need to send a post request. And why is that? It's because the client is going to send a JSON. And when we do a GET request, it's not common to send a JSON. And you need to specify in the GraphQL and have some additional work in order to decide if a GET request with parameters, a GET request with URL, etc. Because much of the burden comes to the client now. Okay, the client becomes much complex. It's going to make the test harder. I'm not saying it's not good. I'm not saying don't use GraphQL. I'm only saying you need to justify it. Only if your use cases are super complex. If all you have is 5 to 10 requests on your service and they are stable and it's good that the service maintains exactly the result, then go with REST. If things become super complex, it might be a consideration to use GraphQL.